Good evening, folks. Another Confederate moment here with IsenhourSpeaks. And tonight we have a guest speaker, if you can't see him. This is Bo Traywick Jr. Actually, Bo is a famous, now Miss Teresa was famous for a different reason. Bo's famous for a lot of other reasons. If you're not familiar with Bo, he's an author currently, among other things that he's done. And we will be posting on this blog some of the books that he has written that you can get a hold of. They're great histories here in Virginia. Now, also, I want to point out something about Bo. You notice the tie the gentleman's wearing. That's a VMI tie. This man is also for the class of 1967, what they call the old guard. Now, this is a real VMI graduate, unlike Coon Man, who is not. You understand what I'm saying? Coon Man, I don't know where heck he graduated from, but he ain't no VMI guy. But this is a real VMI guy. And this is a VMI guy who went to war, i.e. Vietnam. So he is a 82nd Airborne Vietnam veteran. Got that, folks? A real veteran. Somebody that you pay respect for. In addition to that, like you said, you should get his books. And again, we'll publish his books about the things. Now, tonight, we're going to be talking about another friend of ours' books. This is Mr. You might have never seen this before. This is Gene Kessler. And he's down in South Carolina. He's a good friend of ours. And he wrote this book about the war and his dealings with the slavery. And what's interesting about this book that you'll find out is it's well-researched. Well-researched. In fact, it was so well-researched in 2016, when I came across this book, when he first wrote it, we got and raised money for over 40 of these books to be given to the children of the Sam Davis Youth Camp here in Virginia, because I was so impressed with this book. So we're going to be talking about this book tonight, and that's what Bo and I are going to be talking about. But keep in mind, when you think of Coon Man and VMI, put that out of your mind. There's no such thing. Coon Man, I don't know where he's from, but he ain't no VMI. But this is a real VMI graduate right here. So, Bo, welcome.
Thanks, Barrett. I'm honored to be invited here,
Yes.
and Miss Judy doing the technical work here. I appreciate it very much. As you say, we are both very impressed with Mr. Kizer's book. He's a historian in Charleston, and where the Ashley and the Cooper River come together to form the Atlantic Ocean. And he has written this book that I consider to hit the nail square on the head. We Southerners have been put on the defensive ever since about 1864, I guess you'd say. And in our historical debates, we have been put on the defensive. We tend to elaborate on the Constitution and this, that, and the other. And after we have made everybody's eyes glaze over, they turn back on us and say three things. They accuse us for treason, slavery, and racism. So we're put on the defensive there as well. My contention is we should turn it back on them in spades. We ought to shine up our bayonets and tell them that as far as racism is concerned, the largest lynching in the history of the United States occurred in New York City in the New York draft riots in 1863. What caused that? Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on the 1st of January of 1863, and immediately enlistments fell off. He couldn't fill up the troops that he needed, so he implemented a draft, and that caused riots in New York, and they blamed it on the black people up there, and they lynched them and burned them and burned down the orphan asylum and all sorts of horrible things.
Now, let me kind of put a little bit more graphic to this particular race riot. A lot of people will call this, if you'll read the history books, it'll be the 1863 draft dodging riots. But it was really a race riot. And what did they do to these black folks living in Manhattan at that time? What did they actually do to these people?
Some of them, they burned them alive.
Burned them alive and hung them
from lamp posts.
It was actually more horrific than you can imagine, but yet we are called the racists. And it's just want to point out that this is in New York City, in Manhattan. In 1863, these were Union boys who, quote unquote, we've been told, were coming to fight for the freedom of the black man down south. So why are they all of a sudden lynching black people up north? And the answer is very simple. They were not in this war about the race. They were in this war about other things. So now your second point you were talking about?
Second point, the slave issue. The emancipation was a state and not a national issue. Slavery was a state issue recognized by the Constitution of the United States as well as the Constitution of the Confederate States. Free states were free to join the Confederacy, and slave states were free to join the Union. And they, in fact, did so. Lincoln's emancipation was a strictly war measure against the Confederacy to disrupt the South's support troops and perhaps cause an insurrection which would have emptied the Confederate lines.
Yes.
But as it turned out, the emancipation did not affect anybody outside of the Confederacy, and the Emancipation Proclamation said, in effect, slavery was all right as long as one was loyal to Lincoln's government. And this was proven the following summer when West Virginia, a so-called slave state, was admitted to the Union. As far as emancipation in the North was concerned, the various states passed laws against slavery, the abolition laws, but they did not free any of their slaves. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French aristocrat who came and visited America in the 1830s, wrote a very well-known and scholarly observation entitled Democracy in America. He said racism was stronger in the places in the North where there were no slaves than it were in the South. And he said the slave owners in the South did not free their slaves. They sold them South before the abolition laws went into effect. Also, there was a very strong racial component on Northern abolitionism, particularly in the issue of slavery in the territories, because they wanted the territories for the white people.
Right.
They said that, they didn't want black people there. And the first Jim Crow laws were passed in the North. Abraham Lincoln's state of Illinois had laws against blacks even residing
in there.
John Randolph of Roanoke emancipated his slaves in his will, and to provide for them, he bought 50 square miles or someplace, a large tract of land in Ohio. And when he passed away and his slaves were emancipated, they went to Ohio to claim their land,
their property. Absolutely.
And the people in Ohio ran them out of town.
Exactly.
They ran them out of the state and stole their land. So we don't need to hear any more about charges of racism against us.
Exactly.
Treason, all I can say about treason is if you think that it was treason to secede from the Union, then you have to wipe your feet on the Declaration of Independence. Simple as that.
That's very true.
So,
in addition, I want to bring something else up about part of the out that the abolitionists used is the American Colonization Society. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think that was James Monroe. I think was one of the founders,
Yes, he was.
and Monrovia, Liberia, as the capital of Liberia, is named after him. Henry Clay was a strong advocate of the Colonization Society, and Abraham Lincoln was one of his disciples. And
Yes.
so Abraham Lincoln worked until the day he died to deport blacks from the United States back to Africa or to a Latin American country that would agree to take them.
Exactly.
And,
because they didn't want them here. They didn't mind freeing them. They just didn't want them next door neighbors. And again, that existed down the South where you have the blacks and the whites who have always gotten along for centuries. And we don't have the racism down here until the Yankees came down here and created racism. The other thing I want to point out, remember one of our former IsenhourSpeaks, I talked about Mr. Horton down in Chatham County. I don't know whether you've ever been familiar with Mr. Horton, and that's not about Gene's book right here. But Mr. Horton was one of the slaves who actually, during the war, was actually making money based off his poetry. And in the end, they wanted to free him so they could send him back to Africa, in which we don't know what happened to him. He knows we lost this man. This man up in Carolina. We're talking about the Carolina, those vaunted people in Chapel Hill. But let's get back to the book. Now, what impressed you most about Gene's book here that you
Well, the thing that impressed about it me most is the fact that he goes directly to the money question, the Yankee dollar. And if you can let me digress for just a moment.
Please do.
In a mercantile system, which took the place of feudalism in Europe in the 1600s maybe, a mercantile system is comprised of a center and a periphery. And if you can imagine, as a good example is the British Empire. England was the center. The colonies around the world were the periphery. And the center provides the finances, the manufacturing, the shipping, the orchestration of the economy. The periphery provides the raw materials for manufacture and shipping that are exported to the center, and then they in turn also are the market for the finished goods. An Argentine economist named Raul Prebisch had a dependency theory to explain why South America lagged, and he said that the raw materials in a peripheral system, in the periphery of the mercantile system, the cost and price rises at a slower rate than the imported manufactured goods. Eventually, the money all gravitates towards the center. That gives them economic power. People gravitate there. Then they get political power. Thomas Prentice Cattell, a noted economist prior to the war, wrote a book called Southern Wealth and Northern Profits. And he said that the Northeast industrial shipping manufacturing society eventually took the place of what England had during the colonial period.
Exactly.
They were to the United States and the South and the West what England used to be to the colonies. Now, if the periphery secedes from the center is sunk. It doesn't have
exactly.
any.
It has no raw material. It has no raw material.
Itself.
And what actually happened in the 1860s when the South started seceding? What actually happened up north to the manufacturing? Wisconsin, some places where they didn't get any cotton anymore.
No, cotton was king. It was a primary commodity. We successfully seceded from the British Empire in 1776, but England did not sink because the sun never set on the British Empire. We were just a little sideshow over here in the New World. They had colonies in Africa and the Indian Ocean and in all around the world. So they could absorb the loss. The Northeast in 61 could not.
That's right.
So when they started gaining economic power and they got greedy and they passed the moral tariff, which Mr. Kizer explains, and they shot themselves in the foot with that because all they did with that was to drive northern shipping and everybody else's shipping into southern ports, which was free trade and low tariff. And so they could have negotiated, as Mr. Howard Ray White of the Society of Independent Southern Historians suggested. They could certainly have negotiated, but I contend that a tyrant who has the power not to negotiate will not negotiate because to negotiate means you have to give up something. They didn't want to give up anything. They might lose a Yankee dollar. So the North had the power not to negotiate with the Southern diplomats, but that power was rapidly ebbing away, and they could see it. And so they were losing power by the second, although they still held it tenuously. And so when Lincoln took office, he listened to the money men that were suffering in the mercantile kingdom that would collapse when the Cotton Kingdom seceded. And he said the only way we can do it without negotiating is to have a war and drive them back into the mercantile system with the bayonet. Now, what about the West? Well, the West was a safety valve for the flood of immigrants coming in from Europe that didn't have any work and wouldn't have any work. They would not be workers to boost the economy. They'd be anarchists because they didn't have a job. So the West was the safety valve for the North, and therefore they wanted to keep that. If they let the South go, then a lot of the Western states bordering the Mississippi, as Mr. Kizer said, would have joined them as well, and that would have been a total disaster.
Yeah, that's where the birth of socialism in this country began, was in the West. And so the socialism, particularly in Illinois and places like this, where the Midwest, where you had Lincoln's old pen pal Karl Marx and his boys, you had the socialism actually was started here in America with some of the communes and stuff in the 1820s, when they imported some of these people from the Marxist situation going on in Germany. And as they're growing up through, Lincoln became, let's just say, enamored with Marxism, the concept of the power at the central and controlling downwards, and did not like the American system, which had the Constitution, which forbade him from doing many different things. And as a result, he had no choice but to go to war if he was going to preserve his little world, and that's what they did. But again, since they were in the wrong, they had to blame somebody. And who do they blame, Bo?
They blamed the South for firing the first shot. But what caused the first shot? The first shot was orchestrated by Lincoln to, quote, relieve a starving garrison. And the history books of the court historians and the school children tell us that Lincoln sent an armada to relieve a starving garrison, and
Major Anderson.
Supposedly Lincoln had received a letter from him, but nobody has ever found this letter. But on the other hand, the official records show that Governor Pickens of South Carolina had opened up the markets to Major Anderson,
yes,
and give him all the provisions he wanted. And they were only cut off when the word came out in early April that the Armada had left.
Yes,
that was the only reason that he had no provision.
Well, simply because Lincoln had launched this Armada when he said he wasn't going to. Again, this whole thing was a setup. We won't go much into that, but we'll get back to a little bit about Gene's book. The other thing that impressed me the most about this when I saw this years ago was the footnotes that this man has on this book. This is not a theory of his. This is not something of his opinion. This is a well footnoted book, and it talks about this stuff. So you can sit there and say, hey, I don't agree with that, as many of the haters do. They just say, well, we don't agree with that, but that doesn't make it so. What makes it so is the history, and he details the history in this book. And so I always recommend that people have a well-established foundation of what slavery was in the colonies. And I say the word the colonies because that's where it started. Remember, it was old Massachusetts in 1660 that called the British king and said, hey, we won't have slavery in Massachusetts, in which the king said, sounds good to me. And they did. So keep in mind that slavery was a product of the North. And as Bo has already said, when they got to the point where they realized that the labor system didn't work as well for them as the industrial industry came in, they did not free their slaves, i.e. freed their slaves and said, slave, you now can go buy a piece of property down the street from me and move in. Rather, they sold them down south. Keep in mind with that. They sold them down south. And then they claim to be that they don't have slavery up there. This is one of the biggest hypocrisy I think the North ever has, the fact that they sold their slaves as opposed to free, and they could have freed them. All the different Massachusetts, New York, Delaware, they could have done that, but they chose to sell them and make a profit off of them yet again. And so years later, they'd use it against us and say, hey, we are slave free. It doesn't mean the same thing. They actually, as Bo has already mentioned, they actually had laws that prevent black people from even living in some of these states. And then once some of these states got out of control with people coming in, they couldn't control the population. They made these laws that we call the different Jim Crow laws. That was not initiated down south. It was initiated actually starting from Miss Teresa's research in Washington State and also all through the Midwest, as you mentioned. And so we have to keep in mind that when we're talking about this, and this is one of Bo's biggest points is, why we're going to sharpen our bayonets and give it back to them is simply because we have the truth on our side. We have nothing to be embarrassed about. The South did nothing wrong. The South actually was following the Constitution to go and secede, which they did do. Lincoln and his thugs up north are the ones that came down here and invaded good people, not to mention murdered over 1 million of us, and created what do you conclude, at least a century of poverty in the South after that?
All the way up to World War II.
All the way to World War II. Well, folks, this has been a big glimpse about this, and we're going to end with this because I think we're probably at the 18, 19 minute here. And appreciate y'all, but put down some comments. And also, Bo's books about his books that he's written as an author will be on this page too. So hope you go and buy them on Amazon. You get them on Amazon.
Yes, indeed.
And anything
Mr.
else?
Kizer's book as well.
Also, Gene, and he is coming out with a second book too. It will be available, he says, in about a month or so. We'll see what happens. And also, if you want to point this little book out, this is a cute little book that we enjoy.
To keep, the Army says use the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. So I have used the KISS principle with this little booklet here. It's got 5 little essays on the Confederate monuments in the age of progressive identity politics. And it's a good thing to buy in a bundle of and pass around and let the truth be known.
Yes, and keep in mind, you give this to a Yankee, you may free their soul from hell. We never know about that. You never know. So, folks, with that, we're going to say good night to you and let us know what you think. Night, night.